Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the book of Isaiah. Now, before we get into this one, if you struggled reading this, okay, we read Isaiah 23 to 28. It's a little bit longer. So if you struggled reading through this, I understand. I feel your pain because, as I said at the beginning, prophecy can be a little complicated. So I'm going to do my best to just help you understand what we've read today. So let's start with chapter 23. Here Isaiah is prophesying of the destruction of Tyre. Now, this is another one of those ancient, powerful, important cities that don't serve God, and they're going to pay the price for it. Now, the prophecy is that their destruction, now he prophesies of their destruction, but unlike the last nations that we read about in Isaiah, this one isn't going to happen for another 700 years. So the other ones, remember last time they said that they were going to be destroyed and that was going to happen within 100 years no matter what they did, like that was going to happen, it was set in stone. This time it's different. This time it's going to be 700 years, but it's already set in stone. So like in God's mind, even though it's not going to happen for another 700 years, it is going to happen. What's done is done. They're going to have to pay for their sins. So Tyre was a city that looked like they had it all, but they didn't have the Lord. And because of that, their wealth will eventually end up in God's people's hands, even though they aren't going to give it willingly. And eventually, the city of Tyre will be destroyed for a final time and really conquered in 332 BC by Alexander the Great. So now we get into some end time prophecy. In the next chapters, between 23 and 27, really, Isaiah is going to be talking about the end time. So read these if you can, from that perspective. So we can see here in the beginning of chapter 24 that the scale of destruction is going to be much greater than any of these that he's warned about so far. The sinful would be completely destroyed, and as a result, the sinful people would groan under the wrath, or under the weight of God's wrath. So all good things in their life will be gone, and they will be left with nothing but destruction, as we see there in verse 12. Now the next section there in chapter 24, looking really from verses like 17 to 23, we look at the time when the Son of God, Jesus, comes to execute his judgment, and there will be nothing they can do to avoid it. The wicked will be judged. They will pay the price for their sins. So then we get to chapter 25. We're still looking at the future kingdom of God and how one day all of the world will come to know him and will come to recognize him as God. And we will actually all one day come together and worship God. All of God's people from all the nations of the world will come together to worship him. In verse 8, we see that God will destroy death forever and will even wipe away every tear. And during this age, everything won't be great, though, for everyone, because those who stand against God will be dealt with severely. He writes in verse 10 that the rebellious nations will be essentially swimming in a pile of dung, which is a pretty graphic reference. But I think we can see how these nations will be, how low they will be. So those who, like Moab, who's specifically mentioned here, are so proud, will experience complete humiliation at the hands of the Lord. And then we get to chapter 26. Here Isaiah he continues to praise the praise of God's people, the praise from God's people, delivering them from the hands of their enemies. So remember, in the end times, after things are completely hopeless, God will take care of and sustain his people. They will now have real peace for the first time because the Lord himself will be ruling. Remember, in the Old Testament, God never wanted them to have a king. He wanted them to trust in him, but they wanted to be like everybody else, so they had these earthly kings that would really bring them down. But now they will have real peace because God himself will be their king. And we see next that basically those who were rich by earthly standards are now where they belong in terms of kingdom value. So the earthly roles have probably been reversed here for many people. And then for the rest of chapter 26, we see kind of a back and forth between the coming prosperity for God's people and the judgment on his enemies. And you'll see that. You should be able to see that pretty clear if you read through that. And then so we'll get to chapter 27. Which will be the last of this kind of apocalyptic end of days prophecy for now. He starts off in the first verses talking about Christ coming and defeating his enemies on earth. Israel's enemies are signified by the Leviathan, which was an ancient sea creature, but the Lord is going to have no problems taking care of him and the rest of his enemies. In verse 7, though, the news starts to turn for God's people. He says that they will also be judged for their sins and their lack of faith. God obviously loves his people, but those who have turned their back on him will have to be judged for it. And then that brings us to chapter 28, the last one for today. Now, I'm trying not to take all day explaining this because if you read slow like I do, you've already spent a bunch of time. So I'm really trying to just give you a really quick, like a fast forward summary. So do make sure you're reading this. Take your time to read it, and then come back and listen to this as I'm trying to kind of explain what you're reading. Maybe you could like listen to what I'm saying and then read the chapter or whatever, however you want to do it. But so this is into chapter 28, and so this is going to be taking a break from that apocalyptic prophecies which we had talked about before. So he continues what he started there at the end of chapter 27 by talking about the woes to Judah. Remember, Judah are God's people. And so God's people are going to be judged for what they've done. He does promise, though, that those who are faithful to him will be taken care of. But don't miss what happens there in verses 9 to 13. Even though Isaiah is warning the people of coming judgment for their disobedience, they actually are mocking God's messenger instead of realizing that they have a problem. We need to make sure that we don't make this same mistake. Being proud and high-minded never ends well for God's people. So as we get into this chapter, even though the first warnings were directed against the north or Israel, Judah is also going to be judged for their sins. He wraps up this chapter with a bit of hope, though. He tells them that they're going to be judged and the judgment would be severe, but there is hope. There is kind of a light at the end of that tunnel. Just as a farmer knows how to plant and reap his crops and bring about the best harvest, God knows how to restore his people. They needed first, though, to heed this advice and great wisdom. So, my friends, never forget that what a mighty God we serve and how much he can do both for us and through us when we are faithful to him. And that's what Isaiah is saying, that Israel, God's people, they are his chosen people and he wants to take care of them. But if they are not obedient to him, if they are not faithful to him, they're also going to have to answer for it and they're going to be judged for it. And so that's kind of a common theme here throughout Isaiah. And when we look at the end times, what's going to happen, everyone who stands against God is going to be judged finally. This is going to be like the final time. This is going to be when they stand before the judgment seat and when they really lose that battle for the final time. They might prosper for a while here. They might do really well on earth. But we are all going to stand before the Lord someday. And when that happens, we're going to have to answer for what we've done. And what Isaiah is telling Israel here is, in these last days, when God comes back and when Jesus comes to rule, his people are going to be taken care of. But those who are not faithful are also going to face punishment with these pagan or foreign nations that also did not serve God. So hopefully you can make some sense out of that. Hopefully you get what we're saying here. And so that's all from Isaiah. I'll see you back here tomorrow in the book of Matthew.